Hello cousins near and far, and welcome to my channel Ancestral Spotlight. If you would be so kind as to subscribe to my channel, I would be very grateful for the support. Our subject of this video is a mystery ancestor that hangs in the top branches of many of our trees, building a pesky brick wall for us to attempt to climb. For the sake of clarity in this video, I'm going to refer to this ancestor as Mary Sweetwater. Her given name is believed to be either Mary or Elizabeth. Some folks simply put Elizabeth Mary as the first and middle name. Her surname appears to be Sweetwater and/or Clearwater. The source of this surname is yet unclear. However, there is a myth surrounding her, that she was of Native American extraction, probably of the Cherokee tribe, and living in Massachusetts. Her lifespan is approximated as born circa 1693 and death circa 1793, giving a 100-year gap with no solid facts. With no sources, and seemingly only hearsay in public trees and forums, it would be easy and understandable to prune the branch, and probably recommended. But before we do that, let's take a step back and have a more in-depth look with logic and reason, armed with the power of modern advances such as the internet and DNA. So before we build any case of substance in favor of Mary, let's first dissect the tidbits of information given for her and see what's left when we're done. Let's take a look at her husband, Robert Shadrack Cayce. He was the son of French immigrants that came into Henrico County, Virginia, circa early to mid-1690s. Whether Robert was born in France and came to the colonies as a young boy, or was born in Virginia about 1690 to 1691 remains up for discussion. Robert's father, believed to be Jacques Cayce, a French Huguenot, sailed upon the ship Nassau in 1700, departing Blackwall, England, stopping in New York on March of 1701 and left off 191 Huguenot refugees. When the Nassau left New York, some passengers remained on board and were taken to Virginia. And Jacques is one of those reported to have remained on board. At this time, Jacques is noted as being 31 years old and unmarried, so there's certainly holes to be filled. Overall, the general consensus among researchers seems to be that Robert was at least of the same family as Jacques. Now, to those unfamiliar with the term Huguenot, or more commonly French Huguenots, they were and are French Protestants who were heavily persecuted in their homeland and were forced to flee into other countries such as England, Holland, Scotland, and the American colonies. So moving along, geographically, Robert Shadrack Cayce seems only to be linked with Virginia. Being that his family in the colonies likely had Huguenot refugee origins, I'd imagine it unlikely he'd be traveling to and from England, whether business or leisure. He was probably focused on creating a foothold in his new country. And we know that his children held land in Virginia and Tennessee. His son Charles, my ancestor, was a planter in New Kent County, Virginia. Now hold that thought. Looking back at Mary Sweetwater, popular records given for her are a death record in New Marlborough, Massachusetts, naming her as Elizabeth Cayce, having died the 25th of December, 1793. Her husband, to the best of my knowledge, has no known connections to Massachusetts. Robert reportedly passed away in 1786 in Henrico County, Virginia. The four known children of Robert and Mary are Charles, John, Lucy, and another daughter named either Jolene or Julie, and they all seem to have been born and lived in Virginia. So it seems unlikely that Mary, an aged widow, would move from Virginia to Massachusetts on her own, leaving her children and grandchildren in the twilight of her life. So unless there is something I've completely overlooked, I think it's safe to say we can remove the 25th December, 1793 death date and the New Marlborough, Massachusetts death location, and Elizabeth Cayce vital record from Mary Sweetwater. So it's here that I'd like to propose a new possible death location for Mary Sweetwater as potentially Henrico County, Virginia. Logically, it makes more sense. And this is an educated assumption, not fact. Next, let's take a look at a random record commonly attached to Robert and Mary. It's a record within the England Select Births and Christenings 1538 to 1975 collection for a couple, Robert Cayce and Elizabeth, for the birth of their daughter named Mary Cayce. Plainly, none of it links. It simply seems to be a random birth record in England with extremely common names. Now, when we remove this record, there goes the two, quote, sources for the given name Elizabeth, and we're back to just Mary, hence me calling her simply Mary Sweetwater. Perhaps a will or another source document will surface for Robert, or one of Robert and Mary's children, naming Mary. Perhaps land transfers to Robert's sons around 1786, the year he passed, would be telling of Mary's fate, whether she passed before or after her husband. If you should happen to come across such a document, please share it in the comments below so that we all might benefit. Now, taking a look at Mary's surname, Sweetwater or Clearwater, I've yet to find a source stating this surname, which seems to have originated in forums from early researchers. Surname statistics found online for Sweetwater show it to be uncommon and associated with Oklahoma. Likewise, near nothing comes up for Clearwater. Additionally, the same unsourced myth of the Native American origin for Mary seems to have arisen from the same place as her surname, whether family lore or online forum based. Regardless, during the search for a surname Sweetwater, a book entitled Native American Place Names of the United States by William Bright came up. In it, the place name Sweetwater of Monroe County, Tennessee comes up, and is said to correspond to the Cherokee, who were and are to this day Southern Iroquoian language speakers. Perhaps it is these surname and place name associations to the Cherokee, coupled with the surname found limited to Oklahoma and the state's association to the Cherokee tribe, that brought on the myth of Native American descent for Mary. Or perhaps there's something more to it. Again, hold this thought. Let me hit one more point before we come back to this topic. So we can clearly see that Mary Sweetwater has incredibly limited sources. We cannot even prove her first and last name. Yet, a lot of trees online are listing her parents. The parents are listed as William John, or John, Sweetwater, and Golda Sweetwater. If you actually attempt to look for the records, you'll find a very tempting record in the Oklahoma and Indian Territory land allotment jackets for 5 civilized tribes, 1884 to 1934, regarding Cherokee Indians, specifically Cherokees by blood, listed. And here we have a man named John Sweetwater and a woman named Golda Sweetwater, possibly his wife, listed together. And do note the year range of the record collection, 1884 to 1934. Clearly, these folks are not the parents of Mary Sweetwater, who lived in the very late 1600s and early to mid 1700s. Perhaps it's just coincidence that the unsourced parents listed for her in online trees match this one and only Sweetwater couple living as Cherokees in Oklahoma nearly 2 centuries after she lived. No judgments here, but I'm going to make another educated assumption that the William John or John Sweetwater and Golda Sweetwater, named as Mary's parents, are probably inaccurate. And so in my personal tree, I'm going to leave her without parents. So after dissecting the little tidbits of information we have on Mary Sweetwater, we're left with a woman who is the wife of Robert Shadrack Cayce, whom lived in Henrico County, Virginia. Her name is assumed. We can estimate a birth year to around Robert's, perhaps circa 1692. We have her Native American origin myth, suggesting that she was probably born locally, not abroad in England or France, so likely of the Virginias. Considering the birth years of her children beginning in 1710, Robert and Mary likely married in Virginia circa 1707 to 1709. We've ruled out any association via records to the name Elizabeth and geographically to Massachusetts. An additional point to be made regarding Massachusetts and the Cherokee tribe: the Cherokees were a more southern tribe, so again, logically, these points are non-cohesive. Now I'd like to offer something new and a bit more concrete to support that Mary Sweetwater, regardless of her name, was a very real person and that she was of Native American extraction. Two previous points I've noted. One, their son Charles, my ancestor, who was a planter in New Kent County, Virginia. And two, the Native American descent myth for Mary, that perhaps there is something more to it. How many of you are familiar with chromosome mapping? It's where we look at the matching segments with known cousins and begin to identify those segments and associate them with the surnames and most recent common ancestor of the cousins we match. Chromosome mapping, coupled with admixture chromosome painting, can be incredibly revealing and insightful. What you're looking at is my personal chromosome map with specific admixtures painted. I've compared with a handful of DNA cousins that likewise descend from Robert Shadrack Cayce and Mary Sweetwater, and was able to identify common segments that represent the Cayce-Sweetwater ancestors in my own DNA. I've encased in green the segments on chromosome 18, among my maternal line, the approximate 7 million to 7.3 million markers. For me, this tracks properly up the correct family branches, through my Bard line and into the Cayce line. Now, running the World 9 admixture, which highlights Native American DNA markers in red, you'll see the same 7 million to 7.3 million marker area holds a red spike, indicating a Native American ancestor. For me, this translates that Mary Sweetwater is likely being represented here, and if her husband was the son of French immigrants, that leaves only her and her Native American origin myth in play. And this is not the only Cayce-Sweetwater corresponding segments in my personal chromosome mapping project that gives me this Native American marker. Now to the point that Mary's son, my ancestor, Charles Cayce, the planter in New Kent County, Virginia. Kent County, Virginia has long been associated with tribes of the Powhatan Confederacy. In fact, I've made a handful of other videos on the subject of the Native American tribes of the Virginias. Definitely check them out. Among them, you'll find a video on my ancestor Giles Brent and his Native American wife, Mary Kittamaquond. There is another video for the Native American DNA Study Instructional number 1, in which I show these same chromosome maps to prove my descent from Mary Kittamaquond. As I continued my research, I began to notice that the Sweetwater Native American spikes, as I dub them, were merging with those of my ancestor from a different branch, Mary Kittamaquond. To me, this suggests a common genetic relationship between Mary Sweetwater and Mary Kittamaquond. From my personal chromosome mapping DNA study, I'd like to put forth that yes, Mary Sweetwater was of Native American extraction, but likely not of the Cherokee tribe. She was more likely associated with the Tidewater tribes, such as the Powhatan, Piscataway, Mattapony, and others. These tribes are discussed with greater detail in my other videos, showcasing the association of these tribes to Kent County, Virginia. So to conclude, in my opinion, coupled with the DNA finds connecting Mary Sweetwater to Mary Kittamaquond, and the association of Mary Sweetwater's children to Kent County, Virginia, these facts give substance to my Native American ancestor, Mary Sweetwater, wife of Robert Shadrack Cayce.